This story is a bitter warning about the critically important need to adhere to professional protocol when investigating missing persons cases, in order to avoid irreparable consequences and additional human losses. On December 25, 2006, a special celebration was supposed to take place, Heather Quan's birthday. She was turning 21, and she planned to spend the day in a special way, together with her beloved boyfriend, Ryan Voller, and then travel to his parents' home. Ryan, who was 18 at the time, was younger than Heather. He was studying at the same college as the girl and was distinguished by exceptional talent. He played the guitar brilliantly. He had recently moved out from his parents' home, but despite his independence, he continued to maintain warm, heartfelt relationships with his family. Soon after moving, Heather relocated to Ryan's living complex, Phoenix, in Arizona, USA. The place had been vacated after a long-term neighbor had moved out. The girl was incredibly happy and excited about the opportunity to live together with her loved one. Despite differences in character and worldview, the couple seemed extraordinarily harmonious. Heather, a high school graduate, a law school student, was known for her kindness and care. Her circle always emphasized her innate ability to support and entertain others. Ryan, on the other hand, made an impression of a more serious and purposeful young man with clear life goals. Their relationship was going wonderfully. They had already lived together for a month and a half, and it seemed that their differences only added depth and uniqueness to their relationship. On December 25, 2006, everything was prepared for the celebration. Ryan's family was waiting for the couple at the festive table. However, the birthday girl and her boyfriend somehow did not appear. At first, the family tried not to panic. Perhaps the young couple had simply lost track of time. They even started the holiday meal without them. When the lovers still did not return, the parents began calling Ryan, but he somehow did not answer. This seemed increasingly strange, as such behavior from the couple had never happened before. This was especially notable considering that it was not just Heather's birthday, but also Christmas, a holiday the family considered particularly significant. Ryan's sister said that she had visited the apartment during the day, but no one had opened the door. At the time, she had not paid special attention to this, but now it caused serious concern. It turned out that the family had not seen the couple for 2 days. Heather's mother immediately approached the police station with a request to check on the young people. However, due to the holiday period, when the number of calls traditionally skyrockets, their report was initially not perceived as urgent. The patrol officers delayed their departure, considering the matter not particularly priority. The police arrived at the specified address only after several hours. By this moment, Ryan's parents' anxiety had reached a critical point. The father was already waiting for the officers near the entrance of the residential complex where the couple lived. Ahead of them awaited a shocking truth that would forever change their lives. Ryan's father was incredibly worried. His son was ignoring not only phone calls but also persistent knocking on the door. Heather was also silent, showing no signs of life. The only option for the police was to force entry into the apartment. As soon as they were inside, those present immediately understood, something horrible had happened that would forever change their lives. Ryan was lying in the living room, completely beaten, with broken glass and a battered face. Bloody wounds on his nose and face indicated brutal beatings. Despite everything, the young man was alive, though in a deep state of shock. With great difficulty, he could barely move and answer the officers' questions. When asked about Heather, Ryan indicated that she was sleeping in another room. However, when the police entered, they saw a horrifying scene. The girl was lying motionless, with no signs of life. Heather was literally mutilated. Her face was a solid mass of bruises, hemorrhages, and wounds. The fatal wound was a gunshot to the head that instantly cut short her young life. From the first moments, the police began to suspect Ryan. The logic of their assumptions seemed simple. He was the only living witness in the apartment, had barely been injured compared to the girl, and there were no signs of forced entry. The young man's strange behavior, impaired coordination and speech, only intensified suspicions. Instead of providing medical assistance, the officers immediately placed Ryan in a patrol car. Heather had been dead for about a day by then. Ryan himself claimed he remembered nothing, speaking incoherently and confusedly. It seemed obvious that he had spent many hours in the apartment next to his loved one's body. The police suspected that during this time he might have tried to hide evidence of the crime but didn't manage to do so due to the urgent intervention of his parents. Instead of immediate transportation to the police station, according to the words of the deceased boy's mother, Dawn, Ryan was kept in a patrol car for about 4 to 5 hours. Only in the early morning was he finally taken to the police station. At the station, Ryan was immediately stripped of all his clothes under the pretext of further laboratory analysis, instead being given a thin, single-colored paper suit. He was officially informed of the murder suspicion. Detective Paul Dalton demonstrated shocking indifference from the first moments. Despite Ryan's obvious bodily injuries, no medical professional examined him. The boy was simply taken to an interrogation room and left alone. Ryan appeared neither depressed nor aggressive. It seemed he simply didn't understand what was happening. He spent the first minutes with his head on the table, quietly mumbling something indistinct. Video surveillance cameras recorded his incomprehensible muttering, but not a single word could be distinguished. Approximately half an hour later, an officer entered the room, and the interrogation finally began. Ryan was read his rights and asked if he understood the reason for his presence there. The young man confusedly replied that he had no idea what had happened. Ryan was exhausted. He complained of unbearable headaches and an uncontrollable desire to sleep. Detective Paul Dalton, however, had no intention of considering the suspect's condition. His only goal was to obtain a confession to the murder. The interrogation video demonstrated an extremely strange scene. The young man seemed to barely comprehend reality. He sat with his knees pressed to his chest, resembling a frightened child. He constantly repeated that he wanted to go home, and his speech was fragmented and incoherent. Most shocking was that Ryan could not even remember his girlfriend's name. He believed Heather was her nickname and was convinced she was only 16 to 17 years old, although the girl was actually 21. When the detective asked about the bruise under his eye, Ryan pondered the answer for a long time and finally suggested that perhaps he had quarreled with a girl who had struck him. His memory worked in an extremely bizarre manner. At times he claimed he was attacked by Christina, then by Alicia. He couldn't recall Heather's last name at all. It seemed the young man was in an altered state of consciousness, with enormous memory gaps and an inability to connect elementary facts. Paul Dalton, however, completely ignored the obvious symptoms of serious injury. He was convinced that Ryan was simply trying to manipulate the investigation, rather than being in a critical medical condition. Unexpectedly, a new version of events appeared in Ryan's narrative. He began to tell about an attack by robbers, a young man named Richie and his father Larry. According to Ryan, they burst into the apartment with 2 revolvers and began shooting. Most shocking was his claim that they shot not only Heather but him as well. Ryan asserted that the serious injuries he sustained were the result of gunshot wounds. This could explain his strange behavior and complete disorientation. The police officer listened to these stories with open distrust. Ryan's versions constantly changed, details became confused, and the logic of his narrative seemed absolutely illogical. It appeared the young man was balancing between reality and delirium, not fully comprehending what was happening. Meanwhile, the video recording clearly captured, Ryan was behaving like a child who did not understand the gravity of the situation. He constantly asked to go home, complained of fatigue and a desire to sleep. The police, however, were adamant, he would not be allowed to go home under any circumstances. Ryan's infantile behavior, memory lapses, incoherent mumbling, and constant desire to lie down or leave, all of this had a perfectly logical explanation. The matter was a life-threatening injury. The bullet, according to the boy, was still in his head without an exit wound. There was a high probability of internal bleeding that could kill Ryan within the next few hours. However, for Detective Paul Dalton, all these facts sounded unconvincing. He focused on the young man's incredible injuries and constant changes in his testimony. For the investigator, these circumstances were nothing more than an obvious attempt to confuse the investigation. Dalton categorically did not believe a single word of the suspect. He was convinced that if Ryan had truly been shot in the eye with a revolver, he would no longer be able to speak and would inevitably have died, just like Heather. At the same time, obvious symptoms, a combination of neurological disorders, unequivocally pointed to a traumatic brain injury. The paradox was that every police officer during special training receives basic skills in recognizing such conditions. However, Paul Dalton demonstratively ignored the obvious signs. Moreover, he continued to exert psychological pressure on Ryan, not allowing him to rest or receive medical assistance. The interrogation turned into a genuine psychological torture. Questions rained down one after another. Who started shooting first? Why didn't he call an ambulance? Why didn't he answer his parents' calls? Ryan, already struggling with a brain hemorrhage, tried to prove his truthfulness. At the culminating moment, he leaned as close to the detective as possible, looking directly into his eyes. It was then that Dalton noticed that the young man's eye was indeed shot through. Only after this did the investigator decide to send Ryan to the hospital. However, even now the police officer did not show elementary humanity. He did not help the boy get out, and Ryan independently, leaning on the walls, made it to the exit. Only outside were paramedics able to provide first aid and hospitalize him. At the hospital, doctors immediately discovered a fatal picture. Ryan's condition had critically worsened due to the law enforcement officer's delay. The boy urgently needed medical assistance immediately after being found in the apartment, at least 7 to 8 hours earlier. Now, the doctors found a bullet in his head, a significant hemorrhage, and most horrifically, a progressing infection that made surgical intervention impossible. The medical examination clearly demonstrated the delay and indifference of law enforcement officers had cost Ryan his life. Every lost hour brought him closer to inevitable death. The medical saga of Ryan following the horrific attack stretched out into painful weeks. Only 3 days after the tragic events, doctors managed to extract the bullets from the victim's skull. Throughout this time, the young man suffered from unbearable pain and significant cognitive disruptions. The serious operation, performed on December 28, was merely the beginning of a long and complex recovery process that would require extended hospitalization. Medical examinations revealed an extremely discouraging picture. Bullet wounds and inappropriate actions by law enforcement led to serious, almost irreversible brain tissue damage. A portion of the brain was so infected that it completely lost functionality. Doctors were forced to acknowledge yet another tragic loss. Ryan's left eye could not be saved. However, the most concerning issue was the seizures diagnosed by neurosurgeons, which, according to their prognosis, would become Ryan's lifelong companions. Medical specialists unanimously stated, had the police immediately transported the victim to the hospital, the consequences could have been far less devastating. Moreover, there was a real possibility of completely avoiding the complex problems that the young man would now have to live with. During the examination, another telling detail was discovered, a skull fracture, which, according to Ryan himself, was inflicted by law enforcement officers. His behavior seemed strange, infantile, which irritated the detectives. It was not impossible that this blow, whether intentional or accidental, only intensified the negative consequences of the initial injury. The medical personnel directly involved in the operation and monitoring Ryan's recovery repeatedly emphasized, the actions of law enforcement caused significant, essentially irreparable damage that could have been easily avoided with professional and swift actions. Meanwhile, the investigation progressed. The police finally made maximum efforts to establish the truth about the incident. The investigator managed to uncover some circumstances preceding the tragedy. It turned out that on December 23, 2006, Heather and Ryan's day began quite ordinarily, ordering pizza, a calm home atmosphere. However, according to neighbor testimonies, after the food delivery, a former neighbor named Richie appeared, which led to a brief verbal altercation. After a short exchange, the young people parted ways. It is worth emphasizing, Heather and Ryan were ordinary, decent young people, far from any criminal environments. They had no psychological deviations or harmful dependencies, leading a completely peaceful life. In contrast, Richie had a reputation as a person known to law enforcement for minor offenses. The police proposed a version that Richie might be involved in the attack. This version was based on fragmented testimonies from Ryan, who during interrogations mentioned this name. Perhaps the crime was connected to some form of revenge, although due to the partial memory loss of the victim, the complete picture could not yet be established. Ryan, no longer as a suspect but as a witness and victim, attempted to help the investigation reconstruct the sequence of events. The unique location of the house, at the end of a dead-end street, complicated the collection of additional testimonies. Law enforcement suggested that the crime occurred between December 23 and 24. Ryan, due to partial amnesia, could not provide comprehensive information. The suspected Richie categorically denied any involvement. At the crime scene, no convincing evidence against Richie was found. The only source of information remained Ryan's fragmented memories. The motive for the attack remained unclear. The young couple did not possess any valuables that might tempt a criminal. The process of reconstructing the events required significant time and patience. Neurosurgeons, considering Ryan's complex condition, believed that even after being discharged from the hospital a month later, he would continue rehabilitation. The medical professionals hoped that over time, the young man would be able to recall additional details that could help the investigation. Indeed, as his condition improved, Ryan was able to reconstruct the horrific events of that day. According to his recollections, December 24 began quite ordinarily. On the eve of Christmas, an elevated pre-holiday anticipation prevailed. The young couple planned to visit the young man's family to celebrate the girl's birthday and Christmas. Ryan described in detail that morning, he and Heather were in the kitchen. A sudden knock at the door surprised them, as they were not expecting anyone. When the young man approached and opened the door, he saw his former neighbor Richie and Richie's father Larry, who were holding weapons at the ready. Instinctively, Ryan tried to close the door but didn't manage to do so. A shot rang out, the bullet hit his left eye. The young man fell and lost consciousness. The two attackers went to the adjacent room where Heather was. The girl was sitting on the sofa, not even having time to comprehend the danger. She was also killed instantly. After the murder, Richie and Larry robbed the apartment, taking some valuables and the computer. Ryan recalled the complicated relationship with his former neighbor. Richie's jealousy was obvious to the naked eye. Constant conflicts, especially regarding Heather, led to Ryan suggesting that the neighbor move out. Moreover, he even planned to break up with the girl. This proposal extremely angered Richie. They parted ways hostilely, which could have been a potential motive for revenge. The police could not definitively confirm the reason for the attack, but Ryan's version seemed plausible. The official investigation version classified the event as a robbery. Items and a computer did indeed disappear from the apartment. The most shocking fact was that Richie's accomplice was his own father, Larry. Perhaps they were planning a simple theft. However, the revenge version was not excluded. Several witnesses stated that Richie had repeatedly come to his former residence, argued with Ryan, and even threatened him. The protagonist of the story had previously not taken these threats seriously. Unexpectedly for everyone, father and son decided to resort to an armed attack. Each had a revolver, and they were entirely prepared for violent actions. Unfortunately, Ryan could not recall whether Heather had attempted to resist the attackers. It remained unclear whether this was a spontaneous robbery that turned into murder, or if the criminals had immediately intended to kill the couple. The second version seemed more likely, given the instantaneous shots and the victim's defenselessness. The forensic medical examination confirmed that Heather died instantly from the first shot. Most likely, she was killed as an unwanted witness. Ryan was luckier, the bullet did not penetrate deeply into the brain, so he only lost consciousness. It seemed the criminals were confident in the lethality of Ryan's wound and didn't even bother to check. They quickly grabbed the nearest valuables and left the crime scene. The entire incident lasted mere minutes. When Ryan finally regained consciousness several hours later, his damaged brain perceived reality distortedly. In a state of shock and confusion, he even thought that Heather was simply sleeping on the sofa and did not want to disturb her. After the horrific attack, Ryan found himself in an extremely difficult situation. For most of the time, he was unconscious, not fully comprehending what was happening around him. The traumatic time intervals further deepened his physical and psychological suffering. For hours, the man lay unconscious in his own apartment next to the murdered girl. The situation was complicated when the police arrived. He was kept in a patrol vehicle for over 5 hours. The interrogation lasted extraordinarily long, and only after several hours did a police officer finally notice that the suspect was seriously injured and required immediate medical assistance. In fact, during critical 7 hours, Ryan received no emergency help, though the clock was ticking by the minute. Detective Poldalton's behavior raised numerous questions. Why did she not notice the gunshot wound of the suspect, despite him telling her about it? Moreover, why did she consistently ignore his obviously abnormal behavior? Anyone who spoke with Ryan immediately understood that something was wrong with him. Service instructions clearly require that a police officer immediately arrange a medical examination of a suspect. However, Poldalton left the man, believing he was trying to deceive her. Ryan's suspiciousness was obvious. He was the only one who had seen Heather before her death, and it seemed that no one else had been in the apartment. Considering statistics where similar incidents are often connected to close ones, her suspicion was entirely logical. Important information was only collected after Ryan's discharge. This meant that the true murderers, Richie and his father Larry, continued to move freely for at least a month. Meanwhile, detectives practically did not communicate with the victim during his treatment. Strangely, the criminals did not commit new attacks, although they were quite well known in criminal circles. Previously, they were not associated with such violent crimes, let alone murders. Apparently, they did not even suspect that Ryan had miraculously survived. The police deliberately did not disclose information about the surviving victim, as there were serious concerns that the criminals might return to eliminate the only witness. Eventually, Richie and Larry were detained. They were found with stolen items from Ryan's apartment and 2 revolvers. Ballistic expertise unequivocally proved Richie had shot Ryan, while Larry had shot Heather. Richie was charged with murder, burglary, assault, and illegal weapon use. The sentence was severe, life imprisonment without the possibility of early release. Richie's father also stood trial. Initially, his wife claimed his confession to murder, but later became frightened and refused to testify. Fortunately, Larry's mother was not scared and provided incriminating testimony. The prosecution had convincing evidence. The jury found Larry guilty of first-degree murder, assault, and robbery. The sentence was the same, life imprisonment without the possibility of freedom. Several years later, Ryan's father Don filed a lawsuit against the Phoenix Police Department. The man painfully observed his only son's suffering. After the attack, Ryan suffered from seizures, cognitive disorders, and constant headaches. Don accused Poldalton of falsifying evidence and fabricating her own version of the case. It turned out that the detective had a rather controversial professional reputation. Unfortunately, Ryan never learned about the results of this struggle. He lost his left eye and part of his brain, which completely changed his life. The young man became entirely dependent on his parents. On January 20, 2016, nearly 10 years after the attack, Ryan died. Another seizure led to a brain injury incompatible with life. This tragic story attracted media attention. Ryan's parents kept their distance from journalists. Don gave only one interview, telling about the struggle for justice for his son. He was convinced that investigator Dalton had effectively completed what the criminals had started, accelerating his son's death. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to the channel. Until next time, friends.